Hello. This is a proposal for my project called The Evolution of Meaning, Studying the Psychocultural Complexification of Significance. This is part of a broader project I've been working on for a couple of years now and would like to pursue in the form of a doctoral dissertation. Set the context for this a little bit. I mentioned I've been working on this for a little bit, and the first part of this comes a lot from the first chapter or book in the book series, The Evolution of Meaning, in which I set up the context for the complexification and the evolution of meaning within a broader context of a complexifying cosmos. This picture comes from the meta-theoretical framework called the Unified Theory of Knowledge, or UTALK, which is a really great framework for presenting cosmic evolution in terms of a series of emergent information processing systems that come online over the course of cosmic evolution, matter, life, mind, and culture, each being, in a sense, defined by the novel information processing of genetic information for life, which emerged out of matter, neuronal information, which is the basis of mind, which emerged out of life, and symbolic information, which is the basis of culture, emerging out of mind. And this, more colloquially, I guess, could be expressed in terms of DNA, neurons, and words. These are kind of the information media that are being used at these different levels of emergent complexity as these different levels of information processing systems come online. Now, the science journalist and thinker Bobby Azarian has talked about the way that acquiring information, aka learning, is really the way that meaning has complexified in the cosmos across, I argue, these different levels of emergent planes of complexity. As learning entities function in context, they are forced to acquire information about their environment in which they're operating in order to stay far from equilibrium and to get the energy that they need to maintain their informational richness in the context of an entropic universe. So we can really think about the novel information processing systems through matter, life, mind, and culture as also giving rise to distinct contexts for learning. And the basic idea here is that meaningful information is a subset of really all the kinds of information that could be processed by learning entities in their contexts. In this sense, I'm drawing on the work of Artemy Kolchinsky and David Wolpert, who talk about what they call semantic information processing, which is the way that thermodynamic entities can stay far from equilibrium by acquiring energy from their environments by processing the information from their environments in a way that has causal bearing on their viability, which is basically just a more complicated way of saying that learning entities process information to maintain their informational richness and basically resist entropy, which is a process called negentropy or negative entropy. And they do this also to more optimally adapt to their environments in an evolutionary context, which in more advanced complex cognitive organisms requires error correction in terms of their cognitive processes. Ultimately, all of this is about preserving the viability of an entity and ultimately sort of maximizing that viability towards flourishing. So we get a sense in which these different planes of emerging complexity with their different information processing systems create novel contexts in which entities can learn in those contexts by processing the information for meaning. And so we get something like these different learning contexts for these different planes of emergent complexity. Organisms learning in ecologies, animals learning in environments, and persons learning in societies. And of course, having to process the specific kinds of information relative to these increasingly complex planes of existence. Now, I call these different ways that this information gets processed: genetic learning, cognitive learning, and symbolic learning, depending on what kind of information that we're referring to. Now, for my project, I'm focusing primarily on symbolic learning because I'm interested in the way that persons in societies process information for meaning, which is really the complexification of meaning that occurs on the culture plane of complexity. To put all this in a different kind of framing, this is a map that we get from the integral theory framework. It's the same basic idea of emergent planes of complexity, but now we see them presented more in a mandala structure, with each of them growing radially out from the Big Bang as the center. and transcending and including what came before as things complexify. It's the same basic planes here, matter, life, mind, and culture. But this integral model, if those are familiar with this four quadrant approach, gives us a way of mapping the interior, the exterior, the individual, and the collective aspects of this process. Um, Now, on top, we've got the individual, which we could think of as the learning entity. And on the bottom, we have the collective or the context in which entities are learning. And so, the way I would frame the evolution of meaning in this kind of framework is that meaning is what gets generated by those learning entities in context through what John Vervaeke has called the transjective contexts, in which the entity is seeking salience and relevance. And to do so, this requires processing genetic, neuronal, and symbolic information across all these different planes for the purpose of maintaining viability and increasing flourishing. Now, across the broad scope of cosmic evolution, as entities have complexified, as contexts have complexified, you therefore see the actual complexification of meaning itself. As, in a sense, information across these different planes is processed for meaning and becomes more informationally rich. It needs to sustain more informationally rich entities, and the information itself from the environment is becoming more complex and more informationally rich. So, my interest is in this process, but specifically at the level of culture, and really only at the level of culture for my purposes. All of these things are incredibly fascinating, but for the evolution of meaning that I'm concerned with, which it pertains to the sociological, anthropological record, the way that human beings have made meaning. So that will limit us to really just a culture plane of complexity. But now that we have a sense of how that's contextualized within sort of broader cosmic evolution, we can zoom in on this level, as it were, and go from there. And that's what the next two volumes of my Evolution of Meaning series are then devoted to: psyche and symbolic learning, and society and symbolic learning. These are broken down into two sections because, as we saw, we've got two aspects to consider as part of this sort of dynamic feedback process. We have the learning entity, the individual, and we have the collective context of that learning, the sociological angle. So, really, what we're looking at here is an assessment of the psychology of the learning organism, which is to say the human, and the sociology of the collective context. Now, because we're talking about learning, though, what we're really talking about is developmental psychology and sociologies of knowledge. Developmental psychology is what gives us the maps and models for understanding how the human mind learns and develops, and the sociologies of knowledge allow us to map the ways that human knowledge gets institutionalized and embedded in cultural artifacts and institutions for intergenerational transmission. When it comes to the developmental psychology models, the go-to models for the 20th century have been the Piagetian ones. Jean Piaget, a very influential psychologist and genetic epistemologist, developed what became essentially sort of a four-stage model. Across these different stages, the learning mind grows in increasing adequacy in terms of the ways that it constructively relates to its environment and is able to process information about the environment. But again, we're specifically interested here in meaning. And so while cognition is an important aspect of that, to really get at the deeper philosophical, existential, and even theological angles of meaning, we need a more domain-specific kind of model, which we get through James Fowler's faith development theory. Fowler drew on Piaget's and Kohlberg's and many other constructive developmentalist models to frame what he called a theory of the development of faith. But for Fowler, faith is a rather broad category. It doesn't just mean religious faith. It refers instead actually to the kind of thing that we're interested in, which is meaning, purpose, a notion of a broad, encompassing vision for the ultimate environment and ultimate concern for human beings. And a model like this is helpful because it not only studies the way that human cognition develops, but it does so with specific attention paid to the great existential questions about life, meaning, God concepts, notions of religious significance as are presented to the interviewees in what's called the faith development interview. And what's important about this, of course, is that Fowler was basing this model on Piagetian cognitive developmental theory and presented a multi-stage model, not just for cognition, but for actually the development of meaning systems in the individual human mind and the individual human life. The theory here being that religious cognition unfolds in tandem with and parallel to the kinds of broad stages that we see in cognitive growth, generally speaking. Now, what's interesting about this is that Fowler also suggested that the stages in his model have parallels to the collective meaning systems that we see unfold in the historical record. And that suggests a connection between individual meaning systems and collective meaning systems. If we were to map this kind of using this familiar integral model, which has classically made the same sort of move, in Fowler's notion, we would get something like a mapping between the synthetic conventional stage, which is related to early formal operations in Piaget's model, to the pre-Enlightenment mythological worldview, individuative reflective stage of faith, related to the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment rationalized worldviews, and then on into very complex forms of faith, rather rare, called the conjunctive. This is related to what he calls a postmodern worldview at the time that he was writing in 96, specifically what he refers to as a pragmatic postmodern worldview, but which other thinkers have called the reconstructive postmodern, which is what Robert Keegan has called it. Others, like Wilber himself, refer to the integral, and still others talk about a metamodern worldview, but generally speaking, talking about the same structure of belief. Now, this general idea of individual ontogenetic cognitive development mapping to historical development in terms of worldview systems and meaning systems is not unique to Fowler in any way. It's been a claim made by many important thinkers in the 20th century, most notably probably Jürgen Habermas, but many others as well. I'd also recommend the work of Michael Horace Barnes, who does a great job exploring this issue. And so while this has been sort of suggested, it does leave, on the one hand, a couple of basic takeaways, but it also opens up a lot of questions. The basic takeaways here, which I think we can work with as our sort of starting assumptions, is that human cultural level meaning does indeed evolve. And it evolves through symbolic learning, the kind of learning that I talk about at the level of culture, which uses words and language as part of the information processing system of culture by individuals in that context. It evolves across psycho and cultural evolutionary spheres, meaning both in the mind and in the collective sphere, in the sociological sphere, and that involves in the direction of increasing complexity, that ideas build on themselves and that the ideas related in meaning systems become more nuanced, more complex in nature. So these are the basic takeaways that come from the work of Fowler and others like Habermas, Wilbur, Barnes, and others. But as I said, also open up a lot of questions and I would say a demand to be tested empirically and validated or problematized, if not thrown out. And so that is basically what my research is attempting to do in some form or another, is to try to take this basic idea and put it to the test. At the same time, of course, we'd want to see these ideas presented based on the most cutting edge models and methods. There's a lot that we've learned about cognitive development and faith development, for that matter, since the time of Piaget and Fowler. And we would want to incorporate these into any research going forward. Now, on that point, Piaget's model, of course, was developed in the 1920s. Piaget passed away in 1980, and not long before that, there was already a lot of scrutiny and critique being leveled at some of his ideas and his approach, which led ultimately to the refinement and revision of the basic neo-Piagetian paradigm, producing what is now called the model of hierarchical complexity, or I should say models of hierarchical complexity. Hierarchical complexity being sort of the construct that emerges through the work of folks like Kurt Fischer and Michael Commons and others. What we see in this period of neo-Piagetian refinement to the models is, for one thing, a huge sort of increase in precision. Piaget's basic four, or if we count the post-formal five stages, get broken down here into a number of additional stages, which allows for a considerable level of granularity not seen in Piaget's model. And this process continues in the 90s into the early 2000s, and I would say reaches a new level of impressive rigor and precision with what's called the lectical scale. This emerges from the work of Dr. Theolinda Dawson. Dr. Dawson's work has been able to increase the level of granularity, precision, and refinement even more to an unprecedented level. You could almost say that if Piaget gave us sort of a yardstick for cognitive development and the models of hierarchical complexity give us something like feet, then with the lectical scale, we're really working with something like millimeters. It's an incredibly precise way of being able to work not just with Piaget's stages or even those sort of substage level orders of complexity that we see in MHC and Fisher's model, but actually each one of those gets a 100-point scale on the lectical scale, which again allows for just incredible precision for marking cognitive developmental advances. Now, the way it's able to do this is through a process of lexical analysis, wherein words are indexed to particular complexity levels. And this is what allows for this level of granularity by noting the distribution of these vocabulary terms and semantic units in a performance. But it's also theoretically significant as we recall that the culture plane of complexity is processing symbolic information. And as the culture plane complexifies, you would expect to see a complexification in symbolic information itself. And what I would want to suggest is that the lexical scale is the ruler, it's the measure for this kind of cultural complexification that allows us to trace the complexification of symbolic information through hierarchical complexity analysis at an incredibly refined and granular level. And when we do that, we get something like a picture like this, which is a way of understanding the increase of hierarchical complexity almost as a sort of sedimentation process. What we're looking at is basically the distributions of terms, of concepts, of ideas, of language as they unfold in increasing complexification, where new ideas sort of get deposited on older ideas of lesser complexity, and we can begin to establish the complexity level of a particular performance, a linguistic expression, a text, using the distribution of language related to different levels of complexity. Now, one way of thinking then about the work that I'm interested in is trying to analyze this relationship that we considered earlier between individual meaning systems and collective ones using the kind of granularity and precision that we get from the lectical scale. If culture is complexifying and if that cultural complexification is measurable using the lectical scale, then we could theoretically apply this scale to the linguistic productions that we see of people speaking of issues of meaning at the individual level, as well as meaningful information articulated in the cultural record historically as enshrined in historically meaningful canons of texts, which I'll speak about in a minute. Thus, if we did want to test the hypothesis that cultural complexification was unfolding through individual and collective levels in ways that bore sort of structural similarities or isomorphic parallels, we would have to do a couple of things. One, we would have to measure individual meaning systems. That is to say, here at the level of the learning entity of the individual, we'd have to look at the meaning systems, which Fowler's model does a great job of mapping at the ontogenetic level. And we'd have to be able to establish correlates with the lectical scale to try to assess if there are meaningful ways that we can see each stage as falling within a particular range of hierarchical complexity. Now, this first step of the process that I'm proposing for my project, which will involve scoring hundreds of faith development interviews for hierarchical complexity in this way. This would be a quantum leap forward for faith development research on multiple fronts, and I could speak more about that and will in terms of the learning sequences, for example, at the end of this presentation. But in this context, it would just be the first step that would involve next measuring collective meaning systems. Here we're talking about the context, the collective sphere of cultural and historical meanings and meaning systems. And this is a separate aspect of this project, one that I'm exploring in a project called the Cultural Complexity Index already through the help of the Institute of Applied Meta Theory. The basic idea here is we look at the specific corpora of meaningful texts from across human cultural history, and we score these for their hierarchical complexity. The process involves making a very elaborate database of meaningful literature across the philosophical, religious, and speculative texts of humanity, organizing them into various kinds of bins, you could say, with the kind of theoretical background of Robert Bella's Religion and Human Evolution informing some of our decisions around these, and then being able to see where these meaningful texts score in terms of their hierarchical complexity. Now, this part of the process is a little further along at this stage. And I've already presented this in other contexts to talk about some of our initial results. But I will just for this presentation show some of our preliminary data, which allows us to, in some ways, see the direct link between social organizational complexity and hierarchical complexity in terms of the meaning structures. When we scored, for example, our forager corpus of hunter-gatherer stories, we found them sort of clustering around the 900 range. And then by the time we get to complex scribal societies with sort of literate bureaucracies in a agricultural state, such as produce, say, the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Baal cycle. We're starting to break into over 1,000 in the electrical scale. Of course, not too long after this period, you see what's called the Bronze Age collapse around 1177, after which we only find the first of the earliest of the biblical materials, which, when we scored, landed at a slightly slightly lower level of complexity, which we can see bearing more of a complexity similarity to the profile of oral storytelling. And then a few hundred years later, when ancient Israel does develop its own complex scribal bureaucracy and produces texts that form parts of the later Torah, and the priestly and Deuteronomy materials, we see that these actually match the levels of complexity found in those earlier societies of comparable socio-organizational complexity. And now this work already is informing some of the earliest academic literature that we're putting out from this project. This is a paper that I wrote about this and just submitted to Vetus Testamentum. Now, what's interesting about these kinds of studies is that they do allow us to see meaningful complexity profiles of meaning systems at the collective level. We can see that the magical animistic meaning systems cluster around that 900 mark, and we get something like a mythological meaning system that we can see clustering around early formal operations or around 1,000. The hypothesis then is that we might begin to see early rational mechanistic meaning systems show up at a band above this on into modern and post-postmodern complexities thereafter. Now, once we've done this in its entirety and we've mapped a great number of texts across the different corpora of human civilization, we can begin to compare these systems. We'll have, by that point, lexical scores for the different stages of faith at the ontogenetic level, and we will have scores for texts written across human history. And we can begin to then pair and see parallels, if they exist, between individual and collective meaning-making systems. Which is really the goal here from the beginning, is to see if there are particular profiles, if there's particular ranges where there are similarities of ideas expressed, for example, in, say, mythic literal or synthetic conventional or individuative reflective forms of faith, and how these show up in the historical record, historiogenetically. Now, one other thing that having these scores will allow us to do is actually really fascinating, I think, and I gestured at it earlier. It refers to the reconstruction of so-called learning sequences. Now, what these are is, I showed this graphic earlier. This is an empirically derived sequence of ideas related to the word truth that has emerged from Lectica's data And you can see that the idea of truth can unfold in a differentiating manner, such that increasing levels of nuance and gradations of meaning emerge as the word becomes, as I should say, as the concept becomes more complex. And again, in a sense, what we're looking at here is the complexification of words and thus the basis of symbolic information and meaning making. Well, what I would suggest and hope to do once we have enough data is that we could look at a word like God. We could chart, you could say, the way that this term begins to get gradations in meaning and nuances and increasingly more complex kind of auras of significance around it as it progresses through the learning process of the individual mind, both as evidenced by the individual materials of faith development interviews and the collective record of books of the Bible or the Bhagavad Gita or other various religious, philosophical, and scientific texts. So what we're really getting at here is because we're using a shared metric and dialectical scale to look at faith structures, meaning structures, we have the ability to then make comparisons between the psychocultural scales and be able to see meaningful overlaps potentially between the kinds of meanings that people make at the individual level, which gets mapped through models of psychological development, and meanings that have emerged historically that we can see showing up in the historical record and that are supposedly markers of cultural evolution. That is the value that we're trying to add with this sort of endeavor in a way that's never really been done before, to move from sort of sociological theorizing to something much more empirically validated and rigorously tested, which I think will be significant for taking these kinds of psychocultural complexification models seriously in academia and beyond. So, would love it if you would be interested in supporting this project as we try to get the Meaning Lab up and running. And appreciate you taking the time to watch this presentation. Thank you.